Hi everybody, welcome back to Find My Past from Home, the free family history series that is designed with you in mind. It's the chance for you to connect with us and for you to connect with each other as well. My name is Ellie, I'm the Senior Community Executive here at Find My Past. If you're watching live, please say hello in the comments. Tell us where you're tuning in from. If you're catching up on demand as well, we hope you enjoyed this family history session. Now, you will notice, the eagle-eyed among you, that this is a little bit earlier than our usual 4 o'clock in the UK time session. And this is because today is Australia Day. So if you are tuning in from Australia, happy Australia Day to you. And we've also got 2 very special guests with us today. We have genealogists Helen Smith and Therese Lynch. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Ellie.
Thank you, Ellie. Welcome, everyone.
Helen, why don't you introduce yourself to our lovely community?
I'm Helen Smith. I've been researching my family since 1986. I'm a 5th generation Australian on my mother's side and a 1st generation on my father's side, as my father was born in Kent in 1940. I've been researching right around the world, particularly in the UK, England, Wales and Ireland. I run a Quested one name study and they went everywhere, man. And then on the Australian side, Mum's family comes from Ireland, England and Wales. So lots of research there.
Fantastic. And to you, Therese, could you introduce yourself as well?
Certainly. Thanks, Ellie. Well, like Helen, I'm 5th generation Australian on my mother's side and 1st generation on my father's side. My father immigrated from Ireland in 1950 and my mother's family were largely from Ireland as well, ancestrally, but there's also a good dose of English in there as well. Right now I live in Canberra, Australia's national capital, where I run a genealogy business called Your Family Genealogist. I focus on family history research in the UK and Ireland and, of course, Australia. And here in Australia, my specialist areas are convicts, military, family history, goldfields research, land records, and, of course, immigration. We're a big immigration country. I've been looking forward to this today, and I look forward to answering any questions people might have together with Ellie and Helen.
Yeah, that leads me exactly into the next thing I was going to say, Therese, thank you. So if anybody does have a question for Helen or Therese about Australian family history, please add it into the comments. If you could put question at the beginning, that helps me pick them out from all of your lovely comments today. So that would be really, really appreciated. In terms of what we're going to chat about, we're going to have a conversation, I think, about Australia Day. We're going to talk about a little bit about the history behind it, and then we're going to go on to some particular peculiarities and interesting facts about Australian family history, and hopefully it's going to be of use to you at home and to your family tree. Let us know if you have any questions or if you just have any comments, anything you want to share, any stories. We always love to hear them. Now, I think we should take a trip into the comments and say hello. So we have Stephen joining us from Merthyr in South Wales. Hello, Stephen. We've got Sue from Somerset. She says, I spent 2 years in school in Sydney and then came back to the UK. And we've got Anya as well. Hello from Fife in Scotland. She says she's got loads of Aussie friends. Brilliant. Have we got anybody from Australia joining us, I wonder? Let's have a quick look.
Oh, we do.
Yeah.
I saw someone there a minute ago.
It's Dawn.
Yes, Dawn from Brisbane.
Yeah.
Hello.
And Michelle from Perth. Hi, Michelle.
Yeah, fantastic.
And yeah, Dawn.
Lovely. Thank you so much for joining us.
Someone, and Stephanie from, I hope I'm saying this right, Stephanie, from Kudarup in Western Australia.
Brilliant. Okay, so I think we'll get started then. This is going to be a really fantastic hour. The first thing I thought what would be good to discuss, as today is Australia Day, why is Australia Day so special to both of you? And Therese, why don't you kick us off with that?
Okay, thanks, Ellie. Well, I've always felt Australia Day is a special day to celebrate the best of our country, our diverse history and achievements as a nation. But sadly, I have to admit, in recent years, it's become a political hot potato, and it seems to be more of a day of division in the country rather than focusing on the best of what we've achieved. And there's also, of course, the continued debate as to whether it should be celebrated on the day of the first fleet's arrival. And of course, from our Indigenous community's perspective, that was a day of invasion for them. Now, personally, I don't care what date we celebrate Australia Day on, and possibly we should change the date to remove the aggravation that causes our First Nation people, who, after all, were here for 40,000 people before the earliest European settlement. So I'm rather sad that it's no longer the celebration day right across the country that it once was.
And to you, Helen, what makes it a special day for you?
It is a day of celebrating Australia's achievements, and Australia has become a very diverse country now with people from all over the world. The Seekers did a song, I am, we are, you are, I am, you are, we are Australian, from all the lands on earth we come. And that is extremely true. Yes, today has become a day of division. And when you also consider the fact when the first fleet arrived, it wasn't the day the first fleet arrived, wasn't the 26th of January. That was the day the flag was planted at Sydney. So again, planting the flag definitely gives that extra situation of taking over an already occupied country that was very diverse with many languages and culture already in place, which is extremely sad. Yes, we are doing a lot of work around Australia to try and achieve better things and work out how we can become a land of many people with one aim for the future, to do the best for everyone who's here. And as I said, my father came from England in 1949. Anyone who arrived prior to the 26th of January 1949 from the British colonies was automatically becoming an Australian on the 26th of January. My father and my grandmother arrived in May 1949, so they never became Australian citizens. However, Dad was in the Australian Army. He was a Justice of the Peace all the way through his life. It was only when he applied for a passport at the age of 55 he found out he wasn't an Australian citizen. So it had always been that sort of situation. So for me, it's celebrating. We have so many very, very good things, but it's also really important that we look back and see the things that weren't so good and work to rectify what we can on those things. But to tell the stories, for all of you, telling all of your stories in your families, telling the stories of the not famous, the people who maybe didn't even mention, get a notice in the paper when they died, but they're important in your family, and they would have been important in their community as well. And with all the records we have now, we can tell their stories. We have that ability, and we must.
Absolutely. I think that's it. Just comes down into everything that we do with family history. It's telling stories. It's not just names and dates on a family tree chart anymore. It's not. But I'd like to just pick apart that Australia Day a little bit further for anybody watching who maybe doesn't yet know why Australia Day is so controversial. I believe there are a few other different names that have been suggested for it, as well as the different dates. Am I right?
Yes. The First Nations people call it Invasion Day because, as far as they're concerned, that's what it was. And in actuality, that is what occurred. So there has been a number of other names. And it is political because there's people who live in the now and don't consider the past. And I don't think as people we can ever do that. We have to consider the past to work out what we can do to make things better for the future. If you don't know the past, you can't make the future better.
Absolutely. And I think Victoria in the comments has just said exactly that. It's so important not to erase history, but to continually learn from it and share stories. You hit the nail on the head there, Victoria. Tony asking, is it Australia Day now? Yes, it is. It is.
Yes, it is. It is currently 7:10 p.m. on Australia Day.
At 8:10 south of the Queensland border.
Yeah. Sorry, they do daylight savings down south, so it's 8:10 for them. And in Western Australia, it's only 6:10 or thereabouts. Yeah. We're a big country.
Did you want to weigh in on the controversy at all? Is there anything you'd like to say?
No, I think Helen's covered it very well. The only thing I'll add is that I remember my mother, the term Australia Day is not that terribly old. Before Australia Day, we used to have what they call ANA, Australian Natives Association holiday, public holiday on the 26th of January. And to the day she died, my mother always talked about ANA weekend rather than Australia Day weekend or Australia Day, period. So it has changed. It has had various names over the decades. I don't recall any of them before ANA, but I really only remember Australia Day other than my mother talking about ANA weekend. I'd always have to stop and think, when's ANA weekend? Oh, yeah, that's Australia Day. So, but Helen, I think, has covered it very well.
Yep. Remembering, of course, that Australian Natives Association was for people who were born in Australia, whites. It didn't actually count First Nations people. They couldn't join.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've had quite a few. Foundation Day was another day that it's, I think, except there's always because remembering when we started initially, we were colonies. Certainly, New South Wales was the initial. Where the initial flag was put up, and effectively they took over the country. They owned the country. Initially, just half of it, and they gradually took over the rest. And we didn't become individual states till a bit later. We're breaking it up. But we didn't become Australia as Australia till the 1st of January 1901, when we became a federation of states, which has major impacts for your records.
Yes.
I was going to say, and these little contextual bits of information are really important to bear in mind. And I think we'll come on to this in a bit. I have a question from Anya, if that's all right. I don't know which of you would like to take this. I found all the various BMD for each of the regions, but are there any census records from Australia, and will they ever be put online?
All of the census records that currently exist that are viewable are currently online, because the censuses that were taken that survived afterwards, after Federation, were considered statistical purposes only, and they destroyed the identifying data. Yeah, I know, Ellie, I'm crying too.
Yeah.
Anyone who's used the wonderful UK censuses would be crying as well. So effectively, it wasn't until 2000, the year 2000, that we even had an option of actually having a question on the census: would you like your census return kept? With the identifying data, but it would be closed for 100 years. So there's some small fragments that survive after that. Sadly, I'm not expecting to be alive in 2100 when they release those ones. But yeah, so there are some musters. So you've got the New South Wales 1828 muster, the 1842 muster. There are some fragments of the 1890 New South Wales census that survives. But basically, there are no other censuses for Australia with identifying data that are accessible. Having said that, don't forget to look at the contextual information of the statistical censuses. So the Australian Census Bureau has published lots of data. I wrote a blog post for today for Findmypast, and I've got a link in there to the 1911 census information and the 2011 census information, talking about the number of people in the country, the various lands they came from, the ages, how large the families were, all of that sort of information, which still gives you good contextual information. No, I'm really sorry, it's not great like the UK censuses, but we do the best we can. However, don't forget electoral rolls, because women got the vote in Australia with the first federal first federal election, which was in 1903. And those electoral registers are available on Findmypast.
Yeah. Can I just add that Findmypast, bless them, have digitised what's left of the New South Wales census in 1901, 1891 and 1841. And they've also got the New South Wales 1828 census householders returns. South Australian census and Northern Territory census. Not a huge amount, but certainly better than nothing. And it was an interesting one I didn't know existed until today. It's the 1881 British census for crews and passengers on ships arriving in New South Wales. So that was an interesting one. You find something new every day in this line of work. So there is something there, but certainly all the federal census, were destroyed when they extracted the data, which breaks all of our hearts. And I think And I think in the 1940s they pulped it all so they could recycle the paper, which we were desperately short of during the wartime. So
Yep.
yeah. So we can't do better than that, Anya.
The joys of technology when it all goes not pear-shaped. No, can't hear you, Ellie.
How about now?
Now.
Perfect.
That's fine. Perfect.
Oh, yeah, my headphones decided to disconnect themselves. Thank you for that, both of you. I hope that answers your question, Anya. The next thing I thought we would talk about, if we move on, is, again, sort of the history behind it. So I know a little bit about the First Fleet, but I think a little bit ignorant. I was hoping that both of you might be able to tell me a little bit more.
Sure.
Well, you had a little blue with America. So a blue is an argument or a fight in Australian lingo. So basically, prior to that blue with America, the UK was sending prisoners as indentured servants across to America, and so you got rid of people that way. Then once you had the fight with them, it was a case that they didn't want them anymore. So you had a few situations that Gibraltar and a few other places had some, and then the numbers were building up. So there was also an idea that claiming the southern continent before France got it, or Russia got it, or someone else got it would be a good idea. And out of sight, out of mind, as far as ways you could possibly send them. So that was the idea of actually sending the First Fleet to the Great Southern Land. So 1,500 convicts on the First Fleet with associated soldiers and things to keep them under control is what was sent and arrived, which is when the flag was planted on the 26th of January.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, life in Britain at the time was really hard. There was high unemployment, there was high levels of poverty, and the consequence, high levels of crime. And the prisons were just overflowing in the UK. They just couldn't cope. And they had to go to the extent of turning old ships into prison hulks on the River Thames and various other locations. And that was pretty rough, pretty hard life there. And the conditions were shocking. They had to work, you can imagine working in the mud of the Thames River every day, loading and unloading ships. It was a pretty rough life. And they mostly were just waiting, or many of them were waiting for a convict transport to take them to Australia or to New South Wales at the time. And from January 1788, when the first fleet of 11 ships arrived at Botany Bay, to the end of the convict transportation 80 years later, in 1868, over 165,000 convicts were transported out to the Australian colonies from Britain and Ireland. And as you mentioned a moment ago, the First Fleet was really quite diverse in its makeup. It wasn't just British, although the overwhelming majority of them were. But there were also Jewish, Africans, Americans and French convicts on board those ships who were living in Britain at the time and had committed crimes themselves. So they got transported out to the Australian colony. But it wasn't, as Helen said, it wasn't just about those 775 convicts. Nearly half of them, the 1,500 odd, were free persons. They were the officials, the ship's crews, the Marines, and they were allowed to bring out a lot of them a family and children with them. So there was more than just about convicts, even in the First Fleet. When they arrived in Port Jackson, or in Sydney Cove, as it was called, the Indigenous people seemed quite curious but suspicious of the newcomers, and that quickly changed, unfortunately, to conflict between the colonials and the Indigenous people, who understandably were very protective of their land and their resources, and it very quickly became a very difficult situation, and there ended up being deaths, on behalf of the Indigenous as well as the colonials. And the convicts, were transported to New South Wales, Van Diemen's Land, which we now call Tasmania, and later to Western Australia. But many convicts ended up in the other colonies and states as well. They were sent there to build government buildings and roads and bridges. And Findmypast has a specific record sets of Victorians just sent to, of convicts just sent to Victoria as well. So they've got some great records at Findmypast. There's, I think, 29 record sets or something. And of course, after they received their pardon, many did move to another colony to start a new life post their convict period, without the taint of being ex-convicts, which was treated pretty badly. People just shunned them because they were former convicts. And of course, many from Tasmania ended up in Melbourne because it was the closest other colony, and that was before the gold rush in the 1850s. And then, of course, there were the settlements like Moreton Bay in Queensland and Norfolk Island, which were also used as places of secondary punishment. If the convicts behaved badly, in New South Wales or, in Sydney or in Tasmania or somewhere, they got shunted off to even worse places. So it wasn't an easy life for them.
The only state where there was no convicts at all was South Australia. And South Australians are very, very proud of the fact that their state was not founded on convicts or the use of convicts. Queensland didn't get out of it because, as Therese said, we were a secondary place from 1829 up for about 12 years before the free settlers that surrounded Brisbane said, we don't want any more here. We want Brisbane as a port for us, because they'd already been farming, et cetera, on the downs and wanted to send their goods out. So things had started changing because the numbers of free settlers coming into the new land was exceeding, and they didn't want any more convicts coming out. So there was a major push on the East Coast to stop convict transportation. Western Australia, however, needed more convicts over there to help do the work and get that area going and settled. So they didn't stop till 1868. So it's a lot later on that side of the country. But it had stopped on the East Coast in 1850-something, 1852.
They passed an act in 1840 for New South Wales not to take any more. It took another 10 years before they finally stopped it totally.
Yeah.
And then they sent more to Tasmania, and they kept taking them until 1853. And then, as someone said, 1868 in WA. But even though they stopped sending them in those years, you still need the convict records to continue beyond that, because there are still convicts working out their sentence for 7 years, 14 years, or indeed for life. So the convict records go quite a long way beyond them in each of the colonies. So don't just think, I thought I had a convict in 1870. Well, just check anyway, because they might have still been doing their servitude at the time.
Plus, you'll have records that go a bit later, because you also have things like family reunifications. And they were trying to do that. You had a real problem because the majority of the early convicts were men, and you had a massive gender imbalance. So it was a truth that effectively, if you were a female, you could actually be transported for committing a much lesser offence because they needed to address the gender imbalance. And realistically, because of the laws in England and the UK at the time, remembering until you got to the 1850s, you had huge numbers of offences that were a straight hanging offence. And as you got later in the time frame with the intervention of Quakers and other people who were becoming very, very incensed at all of this, that's when you started getting commutations of sentences. So even though by the 1830s you still had huge numbers of people being sentenced to death, the majority of those, like something like 80%, were commuted to transportation. But because they had initially been sentenced to death, those people could never legally return to the UK.
I didn't know that.
Most convicts call it conditional pardon, not a full pardon. And the conditional pardon meant they were pardoned on the condition they did not return home to Ireland or England. They had to stay in the confines of the Australian colonies or New Zealand. And that's why most of them stayed in Australia rather than returning home. The odd one did go back. They made good and had the money to return home. And some of them, if they were caught, they promptly sent back again. But very few actually got a full pardon. Occasionally, they did, but not often.
The ones who were sentenced to 7 or 14 years, if they had money in the family or whatever, a number of those were able to go back. But you had to, of course, pay your own passage back. And that was more money than most people could ever get. Plus, realistically, for the average person, getting land in the UK was pretty much impossible. Whereas in Australia, they had a chance. A lot of them were able to actually get out and get a trade once they'd gotten past their convict days, which weren't pleasant, don't get me wrong. But a lot of them were able to settle dynasties, basically, with land. farming, and being able to do things.
Yeah.
So
a lot of them were able to get, a lot of them were able to get land grants free from the government once they finished their servitude. And for those that didn't do that, once the land grants changed, had run out basically, they were then able to settle land very, very cheaply, for a pound an acre. And they didn't have to pay the money up front. They could lease the land. They had to make some improvements to the land, then they would get a lease, typically for 7 years, that gave them time to get the money to finish purchasing the land at £1 an acre to get freehold. So they had wonderful opportunities, the free settlers as well as the convicts, once they finished their servitude. But it was pretty tough life though, even whether you're a free settler or a convict.
Yeah.
But by the time...
Sorry, Helen, go on.
We started getting lots more free immigrants coming out because, of course, even in that first time frame, you had government officials who were trying to do things and get things started and getting things going. So we were increasingly seeing more and more free settlers, and then which worked to stop the transportation of convicts. But, of course, it was gold. Gold was discovered, and then everyone wanted to come. Surprisingly enough, Maureen had a question about records for seamen who jumped ship in Australia. Now, in the early days prior to gold, yes, there will be some records because they would be legally counted as deserters and there was a reward. Once gold was discovered, you were actually getting entire ships, getting everyone off the ship, just leaving the ship at the port in Melbourne, because, of course, there was this story around that everyone could just go to the goldfields, kick their feet and find nuggets and be rich for life. In actuality, that's not quite true. Certainly there were people who made large fortunes, but with most of the situations, you had what we call placer gold that you could do, like alluvial gold that you could actually get easily. Then once it started getting down into reef gold, that's when you need the huge stamping batteries, big companies needed to go, you needed to dig way down. But by the time that was occurring in Victoria, you had gold being discovered in Queensland. In fact, the gold in Gympie that was discovered in 1869 was what actually kept Queensland going, because Queensland had separated as a colony in 1859. So yes, Maureen, there will be some Police Gazette records, there will be records in the newspapers, but by the time you're getting into the 1850s, you're getting a lot less records because you literally had thousands of people arriving and it was pretty much impossible to keep. And some of the police nicked off to the goldfields as well. But you will also see things in the Police Gazettes like missing friends, where someone's put a query through saying, have you heard of so-and-so? The last time we heard of him was on this ship and we believe he left the ship in Melbourne and went to the Ballarat goldfields and we hadn't heard from him after that. And does anyone know of his whereabouts? So they can be quite useful, and there's a number of those on Findmypast.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Helen. Hopefully that answers your question, Maureen. Do you mind if we do another question? We've got one from Judith here, who says, where can I find a marriage record for my convict ancestor around 1855?
Yeah, fortunately, Tasmanian convict records are amongst the best in Australia, and they have fantastic records down there. If you go to the Tasmanian Archive, sometimes they're called LINC, or sometimes they're called Libraries Tasmania. You can do a person search in there. You should find that marriage record in their online records. There should be. I expect there would be an image of it as well. But Van Diemen's Land are, I think, the best convict records to search for. He may well have also, if he was still a convict, he would have needed permission to get married as well. Whether he married another convict or whether he married a free settler, he would have needed permission. So you could possibly find those records as well. I would also look at the Digital Panopticon, which is a tremendous online resource for convict records in Australia. So I think there's good 3 places you should find what you're looking for there. Yeah, so I'm glad it's Van Diemen's Land.
The problem is if it's after his time of service, the civil registration records for Van Diemen's Land, now known as Tasmania, are, dare I say, worse than the English records because there's a lack of information on the certificates, to the extent that Tasmanian birth, death and marriage certificates pre-1900 have all been digitised and are freely available, whereas certificates for Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria have a huge amount of genealogical information on them that is simply not on the Tasmanian certificates or the South Australian certificates. They sadly went the English route. Tasmania was the first state to actually do civil registration. Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria went more the Scottish route for the amount of information on the certificates, sadly.
Yeah. Judith, I'd also look for his convict conduct record down in Van Diemen's Land. That has a tremendous amount of information. It's not just about his behaviour. It starts when they first arrive in the colony, and it talks about their family composition back in the UK or Ireland. It talks about their conduct on board the ship. It talks about when they get their certificate of ticket of leave and their pardon. It tells you who and where they were allocated to. Try and get that. That's nearly always available for Van Diemen's Land as well. In my opinion, it's the best and most important record. And in fact, come to think of it, Findmypast has those records as well, has the conduct records. So that might also mention a marriage if he got married and had approval before he's finished his servitude. So good luck with that.
Brilliant. Thank you both. We've talked a little bit about the bits of historical context that we need to bear in mind. We've talked a little bit about the gold rush. We've talked a little bit about convicts as well. There was something else I thought would be good to chat about, which was religious denominations. Mm-hmm. I don't know which of you want to kick us off with that.
Yeah, I'll take on this one. Religion remembering is a different thing in Australia. Now, we never had a national religion like the UK had. So it's quite different in that regard. A lot of the people who settled in Australia didn't want the impact of the church. Remembering at the time a lot of the free settlers were coming out to Australia, you were getting that differentiation between the Church of England and the nonconformist churches. So you never really had that same impact. Having said that, you also didn't have the same situations of the Church of England parish in England was looking after the poor within their parish. So whilst we had Church of England, we had Methodist, we had Presbyterian, we had Catholic, etc. here, religion has never been the prime situation in comparison to England or the UK when you're looking in the other countries that it was there. We've had such a range of religions here, including some quite strange ones in modern times, but so it doesn't have the same impact. Also, because of civil registration occurring here, certainly people got married in church. You have the certificates in church and everything else. Lots of people don't actually look at parish registers in Australia in the same way that we would look at parish registers in England or the UK, because whilst they are available in the diocesan archives, they're not generally available. They've not been digitised, and you've got to go to the diocesan archives. They're not kept in county archives in that situation. So religion is a quite different situation in Australia. Because we're also an extremely, extremely large country, the other thing to remember is lots of places didn't have all religions in a place from the earlier timeframes. So you would have a lot of travelling ministers that happened. So that became something different as well. You may have a hall now pubs in Australia, everyone laughs about them, but pubs were a community centre in a lot of ways. Not the way that a pub was in England, that the family would go there, but certain occasions could happen around a pub because it was the centre of town. So you might have a travelling Methodist minister one time, a travelling Church of England, travelling Presbyterian, or a Catholic. There's an Australian poem where the Catholic priest has come through and he's going to baptise all the children, all 9 of them, and the eldest one's nicked off in a huge hurry because they weren't going to be baptised. They didn't know what it was. So it's a very different attitude to religion in Australia right through from the earlier timeframes.
And because, if I can just add in there, often if you say your family was Catholic at that stage and you can't find them in the Catholic registers, it's worth looking at the Church of England or the Presbyterians or the Wesleyans, because if there wasn't a Catholic priest around at the time, they got married in the Church of England or one of the other churches. Whoever was there to marry them is what they ended up doing. So don't be constrained by, well, I know they were Church of England or I know they were Presbyterian. look at all the churches, because you very, as I have found, they ended up getting married elsewhere because there was no option. Of course, there's no marriage celebrants as we know them these days. It was a church or nothing.
Brilliant.
Or the courthouse. Don't forget the courthouse. Justice of the peace at the courthouse.
Let's do another question, if that's all right, before we move on, because I do want to make sure we get to as many of these as possible. Marion says, I believe that 2 great-uncles went from Kilkenny Island to the mines. Is that Ballarat? Have I pronounced that correctly?
It's probably Ballarat, yeah.
Ballarat.
Which state is it? Marion, where is Ballarat? Do you know?
Hopefully,
because it might be one of the copper or tin mines in South Australia.
Yeah, because she's just saying, where would I start researching? Because she's not done any research in Australian records yet. So we just need a little bit more clarification on that, Marion, if you're still watching.
Yeah. But as a general question, I would start, if I knew, well, let's say if I knew exactly that was the place, whether it's Ballarat or Ballarat, I'd start looking in the newspapers to see when they arrived, to see if they turn up in the newspapers in the local area. I would also go, if it's in Victoria, certainly, I would go to the Ballarat Historical Society, who have an excellent goldfields research collections. Many of them are online, and those that aren't, for a relatively inexpensive amount, they will do a search for you. They have great records. The same with Bendigo goldfields and all the other major goldfields in Victoria. They have a lot of records online that they've digitised or they've indexed, and it's always an ongoing process. There's a huge amount of goldfields records in the state archives offices. Not many of them have been digitised, unfortunately. It's really quite sad because there's some absolute gold in there in terms of registers for people who have applied for mining licences and the like. I'm hopeful that one of these days, Findmypast or others will get around to digitising them for us because the state archives themselves are a bit slow. But certainly the newspapers, and you get to those through Trove. At the National Library of Australia, fantastic resource, and so much of the colonial lives were reported in the newspapers. They reported all sorts of things, whether it was claim jumping or deaths or people arriving in the colony or arriving in the goldfields. That's a great place to start to track them down.
Yep, a quick Google search doesn't bring up Ballarat as a place in Australia. So your other thing you need to be thinking about is what is the time frame, because that may tie it in more so of when that was. Because if it's in the 1850s, then you're actually talking, potentially it is going to be Ballarat with the Victorian goldfields. And the really strong thing with Australian records, remember, is the majority of records are on a state-by-state basis. Each state in Australia does its own birth, death, marriage registrations. They do their own education situations. And it wasn't till Federation occurred in 1901 that the Commonwealth started taking on responsibility for a few things like the army. But that didn't really happen till like the First World War. You had a couple of divisions in 1901 for the Second Anglo-Boer War, where we sent 2 divisions across for that as a Commonwealth contingent. And then, of course, the First World War, they took on quarantine and customs. But the immigration had been handled individually by each state who were looking for people to come in. And then the Commonwealth supposedly were going to take that on from 1901, but they didn't really start doing Commonwealth immigration until 1922. And then, as I mentioned, for those of you who were with me earlier, my father came out in 1949 with his mother, who was a widow from World War II. And that was actually under a New South Wales, in 1949, under a New South Wales immigration scheme, because her husband's brother had emigrated to Australia in 1930. So that was a family reunification scheme under New South Wales. So you have to have a bit of a feel for when and where to be able to get an idea of where to look for the records.
Brilliant. The only other thing I was going to say on the back of that was, hopefully that helps, Marion. Try and pinpoint the place and the time, and that will help you with the records. But that leads us really nicely into the last bit of contextual background I wanted to chat about, because I can see us, we're already running out of time. So we've got the convict era, so to speak, but there are other periods of migration that we need to be aware of as well.
Yeah. Yeah, there was the Irish famine. We had a lot of immigrants from Ireland during the Irish famine. That was a major catalyst for people immigrating from that poor country at the time. And then we've got the post-World War I and particularly post-World War II immigration periods. There's a huge migration. There was the slogan, what was it? Populate or perish was the Australian government's slogan. We had to increase our population, and that's when they had also even the second half of the 19th century, there was two different types of people arriving in Australia. There were the assisted immigrants and the non-assisted immigrants. The assisted immigrants were subsidised. The passage and what have you was paid to come to Australia, and there were those who just wanted to come and they paid for their own fare out. And that re-emerged again in the post-World War II era with what we ended up calling £10 POMs. They could get a passage to Australia for £10, which is a way of encouraging British migrants to Australia. So it's a huge amount of records for them. And they're all, because we're post-Federation, all those immigration records are at the National Archives here in Canberra. Some of them have been digitised, but many of them haven't. And for a charge, they will digitise them for you, or you can get someone to go over and get the file out and photograph them and send them off. But they are very good. They hold a lot of information, those records. They have the medicals of the people that came out. They have the reports of the interviews that they underwent. It tells information what they were doing and what their occupations were, where they'd been working. There's a whole range of family information there. So they're very, very useful records for family historians.
Yep. So we had, after World War I, we had soldier settlement schemes where people, men who had served in the British Army, not from Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, but from Northern Ireland, England, Ireland, or Scotland and Wales, were able to come out, and a number of them came out on that. Plus, we had instituted, sadly, the White Australia policy. So we wanted people from Europe to come out, not from other sections of the world. So again, we were strongly pushing for Commonwealth migration to Australia. We certainly had employers would actually bring people out, and they're going to be a bit harder to find because when governments spend money, they keep records. When private companies spend money, they keep records within their own private company, but that's not a government record, and they are under no legal obligation to keep it past a certain period of time for taxation purposes. So sometimes you'll find them in newspapers, or sometimes you're going to find them in newspapers back at home. So don't forget the historical newspaper archive that Findmypast has, because you will often find stuff published over there where ads where they're looking for strong young men to come out. Plus, you may find letters from people in Australia writing back to people at home, telling them what a good time they're having and how great everything is. We also had a number of schemes where some of them sadder than others. So your British children being sent out, sometimes not necessarily orphans. So the British Home Children coming out. You had a number of other charities who were sending children out in a hope for a better world and all of that sort of thing. Some instances it was extremely good. Other instances it's a really sad time in our history. There is a website called Find and Connect. So if you've got family that would have come out under some of those schemes, that gives you information about where you're likely to be able to find records for those. And there has been a lot of good records collated for that. We had lots of professionals. We're looking for certain trades, so lots of situations there. The £10 POM scheme that came out, you're required to stay for 2 years, and then it would only cost £10 to go back. And a percentage did go back. It's actually interesting, of the percentage that went back, about 50% of them left England again and came back to Australia because things weren't. Often you get a sentimental attachment, which isn't necessarily impracticality. And also remembering families that came out with the expectation of not seeing their relatives back home again. And that can be really, really, really hard if you've left parents and things like that. Mm-hmm. So we had a whole range of immigration happening in different places for different things. So South Australia also had immigrants. They brought in from Germany. Queensland had immigrants from Germany. So you do have immigration. Plus, you have immigration that's actually happened of non-English citizens that have come across from Europe, across to England, and then have left from England to come out to Australia, paying their own passage.
Mm-hmm. In South Australia, they were very keen, and they often advertised in the UK and Germany for whole families to come out. Particularly, they were interested in families where they had older sons or older children. They could come out and the whole family would be placed on a farm where they could run the farm for a couple of years, and then they were able to then go, save some money or go to the goldfields and make some money, and then actually purchase their own farm. And a lot of them became very, very successful. That South Australian Archives has some wonderful letters from people in South Australia to the families at home saying, how much things cost and how much money they were able to make, and encouraging them to come out and join them, because it really was a much better life for them than what they had been able to achieve through their hard work at home, because they might have just been agricultural labourers, for example, with little hope of actually ever achieving their own farm ownership. So they came out here and they did very well, generally speaking.
And remembering New Zealand.
Yeah, and New Zealand as well, yeah. Keep in mind that for immigration in the States, pre-1923, they're all in state archives, immigration records. Post-1923, they're at the National Archives of Australia. So you need to look in both location or both types of archives, depending on the time frame, to find the records. And also, I'll just add, even if they immigrated to the East Coast, the ship usually landed at Fremantle, or before that at Albany in Western Australia. So look for passenger records for your family in those ports as well. You'll often find them there, and plus landing on the East Coast. So if it's, they might have got lost at one, then look in the other place as well.
Yep. And people emigrated to New Zealand. We had free passage between New Zealand and Australia until the 1970s. We didn't need passports to go between the two countries. So you had a huge amount of travel between there. Until in the 1850s or early 1860s, New Zealand was governed by New South Wales. Then they took on their own governorship and very kindly said, no, we do not want to become part of the Australian Federation in 1901. So don't forget New Zealand. You had huge schemes going out to New Zealand as well.
Yeah. We also have a lot of passenger records for coastal travel, people travelling, say, from Victoria to Sydney, or from Sydney up to Moreton Bay, and certainly from Western Australia and Adelaide to Melbourne. So there's a lot of those coastal records, so don't forget about those as well when you're tracking your immigrant ancestors.
We didn't have internal railways till quite late in the piece, so coastal travel was a major way. And Shanks pony, people did walk from place to place, but primarily you're going to have coastal travel. There was a question about someone who was born in Victoria in 1880. You can get her birth certificate from the Victorian government. The indexes are on Findmypast and also on the Victorian website. That's it, 1886. So, Christine, you can actually look in there and you can buy the certificate straight from the Victorian website. Not the friendliest website in the world, but you can actually get a digitised copy and then you'll be able to see it. Don't forget to look in the Victorian papers, because you may find some nice information about your family there, because by 1886, certainly there was still gold mining, deep gold mining going on, but it wasn't the prime occupation of the area by that stage. Gold mining for the influx of huge numbers of people finished in the 1860s.
Lovely, thank you. Hopefully that answers your question, Christine. There was another question I'd spotted a little bit earlier on that I wanted to get to, and I've lost it again now. Oh, here it is. This is from William. I'm trying to get information on my third times great grandfather who was transported in 1858. Where will I find his pardon or ticket of leave?
Yeah, I would start with Findmypast. They have a lot of pardons and tickets of leave in their convict resources. If you can't find it there, I would go to Digital Panopticon. It's Digital Panopticon, one word, .org. You'll probably find it there. The pardons and tickets of leave might also be in what we call the AJCP papers. That's the Australian Joint Copying Project, which is a mammoth project. Yeah, now available online. Mammoth project. Takes a bit of digging to find what you need, but even as recently as this afternoon, I got some Tasmanian pardon records out of there as well. So you shouldn't have too much trouble finding that. Also, his pardon and his ticket of leave will be reported in the newspapers, so have a look in the newspapers as well. You don't mention which location or which state he was in, so you may need to look at a couple of places, but certainly you should have no problems finding it one way or the other. You probably won't see the ticket of leave itself, but you'll see a stub for it, and again, it'll probably details will be in his convict conduct record as well. So there's a lot of places out there that you can look. So I hope that gives you enough in terms of some pointers where to look for it.
And potentially be looking over in Western Australia.
Yes, yes.
Because it's quite late. In Fremantle Prison, yes, you're looking in Western Australia. Remember, convict transportation in Western Australia finished in 1868. So, yeah, you're looking in Western Australia. They've got some quite nice indexes online, and the Western Australian Family History Society is very good, and there's some very good records on Findmypast. Yes. And don't forget Trove with the newspapers. There's some really nice stuff happening there.
And if he was even very late arriving in, say, Tasmania, say he arrived in 1852, the year before they finished, if he had a 7 or 14-year servitude or in a sentence, he would still be there. His ticket of leave would come after they finished receiving convicts.
He was in Fremantle Prison.
Oh, it says, okay, I didn't see that.
So it's
okay, in that case, yeah, definitely.
Excellent. Thank you both. Okay, so actually that leads us quite nicely into the last thing I wanted to chat about. Actually, there's a question from Daphne here. This is a good question. Did the Aborigines have their own family record system? Is there anything you could tell us about that?
Record system.
Yeah, it's all oral. They have a great tradition, down through the millennia of oral history, of passing all the stories, the family information, the family records from one generation to the other orally. In the last few years, there has been a push to try and capture some of that oral family history or that oral stories, but they don't have the family record system as we would know it or expect to see it written down.
Lovely, thank you. The last thing I wanted to chat about was records. I mean, we've been talking about records this entire hour anyway. We've talked about the fact that there's no, I can't say this word, statistical census, for example.
There's a statistical census, but no name identified records available.
That's what I meant. Yeah, so we've talked about that. We've talked about things we need to bear in mind when looking at things like parish records because of the differences in how religion is treated. Have we missed anything is what I want to know. Are there any particular records that are going to be really, really good for anybody watching to go and check out?
Okay, so the newspapers, we've got Trove, the National Library of Australia, who've digitised a lot of papers. Now, they have not digitised every paper, but there's an awful lot. Then each state has their own state archives. Now, again, archives in Australia and archives in England are quite different. County archives in England will take on personal papers from a solicitor's office and put that in the county archive. The states in Australia do not do that. What we do here is each state archive is a government archive. It is there for the government department, so they are government records. Once something like the sale of land is Crown land being sold, the state archive will have a record of that, and then the next sale of land from private person to private person is a private sale. So it would have a record in the lands department, but you're not going to find a copy of it at the state archives. So what we also have in each state is a state library. And as part of the state library, you have what we call like a local history section, which is actually dedicated to the history of that particular state. So in Queensland, it's the John Oxley Library. In Sydney, it's the Mitchell Library. In Victoria, the name totally escapes me at the moment.
It's just the State Library Victoria, the SLV.
Yeah, so it's the Batty Library in Canberra? No, it was the Batty Library in Western Australia.
I actually don't know. It's certainly not in Canberra.
So
we've got the University Library.
Got that. Yeah, so each state has got that as part of the thing. And that's where they'll accept private donations of sometimes church records, sometimes it's the local cricket club, all these sorts of things. The doctor who was at Gallipoli, these family personal papers will be in the John Oxley Library if they have accepted them. We also have lots of universities who've had acceptance of these sorts of company records and things. So the Australian National University has a particular area that's actually had a lot of friendly society records, and also Tui's brewing companies, because of course they owned a lot of pubs, so the pub records of the pubs they owned are part of that. So some of the private style company records are very, very hard to find, but they're also not under a legal obligation to be kept, so they can be a lot harder. Government records are going to be in the state government record offices in each state, and the Commonwealth records from 1901, except they took on quarantine, and also customs. So records from the start of Australia for each state, those custom records will be at the National Archives. And then the military records, and then immigration post 1922, apart from individual schemes that were still being run by the different states. So that's a requirement. Each state, you'll have Commonwealth electoral rolls, but you'll also have state electoral rolls. We also have council electoral rolls. Voting in Australia is mandatory and became mandatory from 1922 or 23. And so it's mandatory for us to vote in council elections, state elections, and federal elections. Council electoral rolls don't tend to be digitised, but they are available historically in council archives. You'll also have town archives. Then you've got things like perhaps the Queensland Ambulance Transport Brigade archives, the Fire Brigade archives, and the Queensland Freemasons archives. So there's lots of these different archives depending upon what you want. Google is your friend at times. Findmypast has certainly been digitising a number of special collections as they go. Things like some of the Calais lace makers who emigrated to South Australia is a collection which is not the first collection you'd ever think about, is available on Findmypast. And okay, there's under 300 people listed in that, but it's a pretty specialist sort of thing. So you have to know your place, you have to know your time frame as to who's handling the record. Each state runs its own court system. Each state runs its own police force. You'll have militia from 1860 up until 1913 or thereabouts in each state, because the English army left in 1860. After that, it was up to each colony to look after its own security. And then, of course, the federal government took it on just prior to World War II. But you still had like cadet corps and things like that that actually went through to the 1930s, which were held by each state archive. Education is run by each state. So it's sort of depending on what you're looking for as to where you're going to be looking at what time frame.
I just add to that, we haven't talked about military records terribly much. Australian War Memorial has an excellent online resource for you can do name searching, and there's records in there which are not in soldiers and naval officers and Air Force officers' service records. They have a lot of additional records in there. Keep in mind too that the convicts' records, or in terms of convicts, often their trials were reported in depth in the newspapers, in the Irish newspapers and the British newspapers, which of course you'll get from Findmypast. And generally with convicts, you'll get more records about them in Australia than where they came from. The records, they were very good at record keeping here in Australia, better than they were from where they come from generally, but you still need to look in both places because you will get good information out of the newspapers. They also always reported when the convict transports departed, so you get a sense then of when they headed out on their journey. And the National Library of Australia, family history is one of their collections, and they've got some fantastic records there, and they have a very good e-resources section online. So you go to e-resources, one of the topics will be genealogy, and then you can break it down to national and state by state. So they're certainly worth working through as well. You get a lot of records, different record sets in there, which you wouldn't necessarily think about. For example, one of my favourites is the Goldfield Hospital admission records. I quite often find people in there that I'm looking for. So there are some very good online sources that I but credit where it's due. I think Findmypast have got some great records in there for us when it comes to Australian records, particularly convicts and to a lesser extent, immigration.
There's two other websites to be which are index websites. So you've got Cindy's List, which has a good Australian section, and you've got something called Cora Web, which is run by Cora Num, which again is a link site to Australian sites, which is also extremely good. But first port of call is look through your Findmypast through the catalogue and put Australia in, and then browse, because you'd be amazed at what you can find when you browse. And the record, and look, sorry, I will tell you straight up that once you start doing this, it's not my responsibility for what doesn't get done, because you'll start diverging and going down rabbit holes, because there's so many extra special little things that you can suddenly go into. So you'll suddenly find things like indexes to undertaker records, and then you'll also be able to see there where some of those original indexes were, who did those indexes, who may have further information for you as well.
Excellent. I think we've covered an awful lot in just the space of an hour, and it's been a sort of a whistle-stop tour, I think. There's one more comment I'd like to bring up on screen, if that's all right. It's from Leanne. She says, I've never found a birth or marriage for my great-grandmother, Rose Grace Westlake, said to be born in St Leonards, New South Wales, about 1884, and died in St Leonards, Tasmania. I've looked for decades. Is there anything, any advice you could offer, Leanne?
1884.
Okay, you've got St Leonards in two places, which initially gives me major alarm bells. How confident are you that it is St Leonards, New South Wales and St Leonards, Tasmania? St Leonards, Tasmania, she died in 1884, remembering that the Tasmanian certificates are online on the Lynch site, but what you're going to get is potentially Rose Grace Westlake died, the date she died, where she died, and no genealogical information. And you potentially get the name she was going by or that she was known by at the time of her death, which may not be Rose Grace Westlake. And that's one of the huge problems. It would be quite unusual to be born in the same name placed in two different states. So I have questions about that to start with. The New South Wales indexes are on Findmypast, and they're also on the New South Wales website. They're freely available there. Not the easiest to search, but they are available there. I'd also have a look, because it's a nice name. It's not Smith, thank heavens. So definitely look in Trove and see what you come up with there, because the New South Wales newspapers and the Tasmanian newspapers have been quite well digitised. If you then get an exact date of birth or an exact date of death, then you could actually write to the state government in each place, the Registrar General of each state, and ask them if they can find it for you. They will do that for a fee.
Brilliant. Well, I think that brings us nicely to the end, actually. It's been a really eye-opening hour for me in particular, because I am woefully undereducated with Australian history, Australian family history. So for me personally, this has been an absolute pleasure. So thank you both, Helen, Therese, thank you. Is there anything you'd like to say before we wrap up? A lot of people saying thank you in the comments, saying it's been really informative. Have you got any closing comments at all?
I did a couple of other sessions, one which was on Australian migration with Findmypast with Jen Baldwin, and the other one was on Australian military records. So go and spend some time having a look at some of those as well, because they can give you some extra clues with what other potential records you could be looking at. And I expect we'll both be back.
Yes.
Let's hope.
So send Ellie some hints about what you'd like us to talk about next time.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody watching at home, if there's anything you would like Helen or Therese to cover at a later date, pop it into the comments and we will have a look at them and we'll see what we can do for you. Because as I said at the beginning, these sessions, that they are for you, and they're a place for you to connect with each other and hopefully to learn something new as well. So yeah, this has been lovely. Just a couple of housekeeping things for when we finish up. So not tomorrow, because we don't have a Wednesday session tomorrow. It's going to be on Thursday instead. Miko is going to be doing a session on coats of arms, on tartans, on clans and kilts and things like that. So make sure you tune back for that. That's going to be 4 o'clock UK time, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And then on Friday, we've got Jen, who's going to be back for Friday's Live. And we're doing something a little bit special for this Friday's Live, actually. You'll hear more about it on Wednesday. So keep an eye out on our Facebook page, because we'll be asking you some questions in advance. Don't want to spoil anything else, because otherwise I will spoil it. So yeah, this has been lovely. Lots of people saying thank you in the comments. This is fantastic. Thank you everybody for joining. And
actually, I'll just make one extra comment. Yeah. Don't forget the Facebook page, because we have lots of people on the Facebook page with lots of information. Therese and I both lurk there, and yes, we are at slightly different time frames, but we often answer questions there as well. So if you have questions, put them on the Findmypast Facebook page. There's lots and lots of people from all over the world who'd be willing to actually help answer the question. I saw there was an early question about a 1620 emigration to by Mr. Sampson to America. I know there was immigration there, but that's not my specialty. But there will be someone on the Findmypast Facebook page where it will be something they know something about. So don't forget that as a community resource. It's extremely good.
Brilliant. Excellent. Well, yeah, everybody have, if you're in Australia, enjoy the rest of Australia Day. And if you are in the UK or anywhere else in the world, I hope you have a fantastic day. Thank you both, Helen and Therese. And thank you, everybody at home. Take care of yourselves.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. It's been fun. Bye.